Bismillahir-Rahman-ir-Rahim. Welcome to the Missing Dots, where today we expose one of the greatest intellectual illusions of our time, the belief that ancient texts can be understood through modern eyes. For centuries, people have tried to decode 7th century Arabic using 21st century dictionaries, unaware that every idiom, every metaphor, every poetic gesture carried meanings that no translation can fully capture. Tonight, we uncover how a single mistranslated word can reshape theology, distort law, and mislead entire civilizations, and why the real problem isn't the Quran or ancient texts. It's the language we insist on reading them in.
You know, it feels really peaceful out here in the courtyard tonight.
Yeah, it really does.
I mean, the prayer is over, people have gone home, and the air has finally cooled down a bit. It was just a good place to sit and think.
It is. Sitting here looking at the night sky, you sort of start thinking about distance.
Right.
Not just miles, but the distance of time. And if you are listening to this right now, wherever you are, maybe driving home, maybe doing the dishes, I want you to think about how you understand the words you read every single day.
Because we usually treat language like a simple container, like a glass you pour a meaning into. And as long as you have the glass, well, you have the meaning.
Which is a very mechanical way of looking at it, I think.
Right, exactly.
But language is not a glass. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. It grows, it shifts, it forgets things, it invents new things.
Yeah.
And when we sit down to read something from 1400 years ago specifically, the Arabic of the 7th century, we are dealing with a chasm that most people do not even realize exists.
That is exactly what has been bothering me all week while reading through these notes. I mean, we open a translation or even a modern Arabic-English dictionary, we look up a word from a 1400-year-old text, and we just assume we have found the absolute truth.
Yes, we really do.
It feels like an illusion of comprehension,
Look.
We think we understand because the letters look exactly the same. It is an illusion. And to see why it is an illusion, we kind of have to rewind. We have to go back to what the Arabic language actually was in the 7th century, out in the deserts of the Hijaz and the Najd, before the massive city, before the empire.
So paint that picture for us.
Yeah.
Because there is an assumption today, and I think a lot of people hold this without even saying it out loud, that the Arabs of the 7th century were just simple desert nomads.
Right, the stereotype.
Exactly. And if the people lived simple lives in tents, their language must have been simple too. Sort of a rough, primitive dialect that did not really have any rules until scholars came along centuries later to clean it up.
That is probably one of the biggest historical misconceptions out there. The reality is the exact opposite.
Really?
Yeah. The pre-Islamic Arabic spoken by those tribes was a language of staggering structural complexity. It was incredibly dense. It was not some immature dialect at all. It was a highly mature, highly evolved system.
But how mature are we talking? I mean, if they didn't have massive libraries and universities, how complex could it really be?
Well, we are talking about a vocabulary so massive, it is genuinely hard for a modern English speaker to even process. Classical philologists, the people who studied this language a few centuries later, they estimated millions of lexical derivations.
Millions.
Millions. The Arabs had this concept called the Diwan al-Arab, which basically translates to the Register of the Arabs.
But they were an oral culture. That register wasn't a physical book, was it?
No, the register was their poetry.
Ah, right.
Poetry was the supreme archive of their entire civilization. If a tribe needed to remember a legal treaty, they put it in a poem. If they needed to remember a blood feud, an alliance, the geography of a valley, or even a specific type of weather, it went into the poetry.
That is fascinating.
And the sheer density of the vocabulary in that oral archive is astonishing. You often hear that they had hundreds of different words for a sword or a camel or a lion.
I was actually reading about that. Hundreds of words for a lion. But wait, let me challenge that for a second.
Yeah.
Why would anyone need 500 ways to say lion? It just sounds like they were inventing synonyms for no reason, just to sound poetic.
Well, that is the thing. True synonymy barely existed in classical Arabic. They were not just saying lion 500 different ways.
Okay, so what were they doing?
Every single word had a precise, distinct, visual or historical resonance.
Give me a sense of what that actually looks like in practice.
So, for example, one word might mean a lion that is stalking its prey in the tall grass.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Another word means a lion that has just eaten and is resting. Another is a lion seen from a distance at dusk. Another is a lion that is actively protecting its cubs.
So it is capturing the entire scene, not just the animal.
Exactly. Every word carried a specific context, a specific moment in time. The language was hyper-adapted to their environment.
Oh.
You see the exact same thing with camels. There wasn't just one generic word for camel.
Right, because camels were everything to them.
Yes. There was a word for a camel that is thirsty, a camel that is lost, a camel walking in a very specific rhythm.
That is incredible. But it makes me wonder how the language actually functioned mechanically. I mean, if I have to memorize a completely different random word for every single situation, my brain would just explode.
Well, you wouldn't memorize random words because Arabic doesn't work like English at all. It is what we call a templatic or root-based language. Think of the three-letter root of an Arabic word, like the basic ingredients of a dough. Flour, water, and yeast.
Okay, I am following you. The dough is the root.
Right. Let's take the root KTB, which has to do with writing. That is your dough. Now, the vowels and the extra letters you add around that root, those are your cookie cutters.
I see.
No matter what shape you cut out, it will always taste like that base root. So if you apply the person who does the action cookie cutter, you get katib, a writer.
Ah, okay.
If you apply the place where the action happens cookie cutter, you get maktab, a desk or an office. If you apply the thing that receives the action cookie cutter, you get maktab, a letter or something that is written.
So it is incredibly mathematical. You have these roots, and you just plug them into these formulas.
Very mathematical. From one three-letter root, you can generate hundreds of specific, nuanced words. And the Bedouins understood this intuitively. They had something called al-salika.
Al-salika, what does that mean exactly?
Native, unreflective mastery. Innate intuition.
Okay.
They possessed an unconscious command of the language. They navigated not just the vocabulary, but a highly complex case system, what we call IREB, without ever even thinking about it.
Explain IREB to me, because I know that is a huge part of why the language is so hard to master today.
Sure. Think about English first. In English, word order tells you who did what. If you say the dog bit the man, you know the dog is the attacker.
Right.
If you flip the words and say the man bit the dog, the meaning completely reverses. Word order is everything.
Right. The structure gives you the meaning.
In 7th century Arabic, word order doesn't matter nearly as much. The vowels at the very end of the words tell you who did what.
Really? Just the vowels?
Just the vowels. For example, if the word for dog ends in an U sound, adama, it means the dog is doing the action. If the word for man ends in a sound, a fatha, he is receiving the action.
Oh, wow.
So you could put the words in almost any order in the sentence, and the listener would instantly know the dog bit the man, purely based on that tiny vowel sound at the very end.
SubhanAllah. So if I am reciting a poem and I accidentally swap that tiny U sound for a sound...
You have just changed the biter into the bitten. You have completely inverted reality.
That is wild.
But the native Bedouins never made those mistakes. A child growing up in that environment acquired these complex grammatical rules just by breathing the air, listening to the poetry at night, hearing the adults speak in the marketplace.
You know, it reminds me of musical prodigy. Imagine a kid who can sit at a piano and play a ridiculously complex, mathematically perfect symphony completely by ear.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, they don't know how to read sheet music. They don't even know what a time signature is. But they play flawlessly, and if they hit a wrong note, they wince because they feel it in their bones. They don't need the sheet music because they are the music.
Exactly. The Bedouins were the grammar. They didn't write the rules down in textbooks because the rules lived in their minds and on their tongues.
Oh.
In that oral culture, making a mistake, what they called a lon, a linguistic error, was socially shameful.
I can imagine.
It was immediately noticed and corrected by everyone around them.
So we have this perfect, isolated oral ecosystem, a language of supreme eloquence, operating entirely by native intuition. But things didn't stay isolated out in the desert forever.
No, they didn't. History happened. Within a few decades of the Prophet Muhammad's passing, peace be upon him, the Islamic Empire expanded at a breathtaking pace. You suddenly had millions of non-Arab converts entering the fold, Persians, Copts, Berbers.
And all these people are trying to learn Arabic.
They are trying to speak Arabic, they are trying to pray, they are trying to recite the Quran, and they are bringing their own native linguistic habits with them.
So the prodigy's perfect symphony is suddenly being played by a million beginners.
Exactly. And the mistakes started multiplying. This is the crisis of law, the spread of linguistic corruption. In an urban center like Basra or Kufa in Iraq, you had Arabs intermarrying with non-Arabs, and their children were growing up hearing a simplified, broken version of the language in the streets.
Losing that natural intuition.
Yes. They were dropping those crucial case endings. They were mispronouncing vowels.
Which is a huge problem. You mentioned earlier that changing a vowel changes who bit who. If you do that with a sacred text.
It is an existential threat. And there is a famous historical anecdote about this.
Oh, share it, please.
Someone was reciting verse 3 from chapter 9 of the Quran. The verse is supposed to say, Allah is free from obligation to the polytheists, and so is his messenger, meaning God and the prophet are together in this stance. In Arabic, the word for messenger ends in a dhamma, a U sound. Rasuluhu.
Okay, so the U sound links the messenger to God in the grammatical sentence.
Exactly. But the man reciting it accidentally read it with a kasra, an I sound. He said Rasulihi.
Oh no, what does that do to the meaning?
It changes the grammatical subject into the object. By making that one tiny vowel change, the sentence suddenly meant Allah is free from obligation to the polytheists, and he is also free from obligation to his messenger.
Subhanallah. So a mispronounced vowel literally creates heresy. It turns the theology completely upside down.
Yes. The man who heard this recitation, a scholar, was horrified. He immediately realized that the spoken language was breaking down, and if they didn't act quickly, the text would be lost forever.
So what did they do to stop the bleeding?
This is where the codification of Arabic grammar comes in. The sciences of na, which is syntax, and sarf, which is morphology.
So these early grammar books we always hear about, they weren't invented to teach the Arabs how to speak properly.
No, not at all. They were a desperate defensive maneuver to preserve a dying oral reality. Scholars like Abu al-Aswad al-Duwali, who's actually credited with putting the first tiny dot marks on the text to preserve the vowels, realized they had to write the rules down before the native intuition faded entirely.
That makes total sense.
And the most famous grammarian of all was a man named Sibawayh.
I have read a little bit about Sibawayh. He wasn't even Arab, was he?
No, he was a Persian native speaker. Which, if you think about it, makes perfect sense. Native speakers don't usually sit around analyzing their own language. They just speak it naturally.
Right, you don't think about how you walk, you just walk.
Exactly. It was the non-native speakers who had to learn the system from the outside, who mapped its internal structures with such incredible objectivity. Sibawayh left the cities. He went out into the deep desert to find the Bedouins, the pure speakers, who still possessed that al-salika, that native intuition.
Wow, he went straight to the source.
He did. He listened to them. He recorded their poetry. He observed the language the way a biologist observes animals in the wild.
So he didn't invent the grammar, he just captured it.
He extracted the rules from the speakers and fossilized them on paper so they wouldn't be lost forever.
It's almost like taking a mold of a beautiful, intricate sculpture right before a flood washes the original away.
That is a very apt way to look at it. But here's the catch. While the grammar was saved on paper, frozen in time to protect the sacred texts, the living, spoken language out in the streets of the empire, it didn't stop. It kept moving. It kept changing.
Because you can't freeze a living language. I mean, people still have to buy groceries and talk to their neighbors.
Exactly. And that brings us to the massive tectonic rift we face today. Over the next 14 centuries, the Arabic language underwent a profound evolution. We go from classical Arabic in the 7th century to Middle Arabic and eventually to what we call today Modern Standard Arabic, or MSA.
And MSA is what you hear on the news today or what you read in a modern newspaper in Cairo or Dubai.
Right. And MSA is a simplified analytic register. It has lost a lot of the inflection, the dense case endings, and the hyper-specific vocabulary of classical Arabic.
I want to pause here because this is where the danger really starts for someone like me, or really anyone listening right now. If I open a copy of the Quran today, the words look exactly the same on the page as they did 1,400 years ago. The physical letters haven't changed, so I just naturally assume the meaning hasn't changed.
Yes, that is the assumption.
But you're saying the meanings living inside those letters might have drifted miles away from where they started.
We call these lexical false friends. It happens in every language. It is when a word looks very familiar to you, so you immediately assume you know what it means. But historically, it meant something entirely different.
That is dangerous.
It is. If a modern reader opens a standard Arabic-English dictionary today, like the Hansware Dictionary, which is very popular, and looks up a 7th century word, they're essentially committing chronological colonization.
Chronological colonization. I really like that phrase, but let's break it down. Basically, we are kidnapping a word from the past and forcing it to work a modern job.
Yes. We are forcing a modern reality onto an ancient text.
Give me a concrete example of this, something people use every day.
Think about the word sayyara. In modern standard Arabic today, if you say sayyara, you are talking about an automobile, a car.
Right. If you rent a sayyara at the airport, you are getting a car.
But in the 7th century, the root of that word meant to travel or move continuously. A sayyara was a traveling group, a caravan. So when the Quran tells the story of the Prophet Joseph, Prophet Yusuf, peace be upon him, and it says a sayyara came and found him in the well.
If you read that with a modern mind without historical context, you're literally picturing a Toyota pulling up to the well.
And while it sounds absurd when you say it out loud, it proves the point perfectly. The word survived, but the meaning mutated completely.
What about something more subtle, something that might change how we view the imagery or the aesthetic of the text?
Take the word nar. In modern Arabic, nar means river. So when modern readers see the descriptions of paradise in the Quran gardens beneath which anhar flow, the plural of nar, they picture massive, roaring rivers. They imagine the Nile or the Amazon surging under the ground.
Yeah, that is exactly what I picture. Huge subterranean rivers.
But that is not what it meant to the 7th century Arab in the Hijaz. Classically, nar referred to any flowing water, right down to the smallest rivulet or stream used for irrigation in a small garden.
Oh, wow.
The imagery wasn't about massive, dangerous rivers. It was about gentle, life-giving garden streams. When you realize that, the aesthetic, the feeling of the verse, changes completely. It becomes intimate instead of overwhelming.
That really does shift the whole picture. But let's look at a word that shapes how we actually practice or understand our place in the world.
A great example of that is the word din. Today, we translate din almost universally as religion.
Which seems totally straightforward. I mean, what else would it mean?
It seems straightforward to us because we live in a modern post-Enlightenment world. When we say religion in English today, we usually mean a private internal belief system. We separate it from politics, from law, from the public square.
Right. We say, that's my personal religion. I keep it in my heart or just in my home.
Exactly. Yeah. But to a 7th century Arab, din meant something much heavier. It has roots in indebtedness. It meant obligation. It meant a system of governance bounded by law, custom, and social contract. It was public. It was binding.
That is a huge difference.
So when the Quran says there is no compulsion in the din, a modern person reads that and thinks, oh, nobody can force me to have a certain private belief in my heart.
But the classical meaning is bigger than that.
Much bigger. It means nobody can force you into this specific legal and political obligation, this system of governance. It's not just about what you feel internally. It's about your place in the social and legal order.
You know, I am sitting here thinking about how terrifying this is for a modern reader. If everyday words like river and religion can trick us like this, how can anyone trust their own intuition when reading these ancient texts? I read a translation, I feel like I understand it, but I might be completely missing the point.
It is a profound realization, and honestly, it gets even more complicated when we introduce another linguistic feature of the ancient world, polysemy.
Polysemy. That is the idea that one word can mean many different things at the same time, right?
Yes. In the classical Islamic sciences, this is studied under the term wuju al-nazair. Ancient Arabic was deeply polysymous. A single word could carry multiple, distinct layers of meaning simultaneously.
And this goes completely against how we are trained to think today. I mean, if you're listening to this, think about how you operate at work. We have what you'd call a monosemic bias. We expect one word to equal one exact dictionary definition, like a math equation.
Because we live in a world of technical manuals, legal contracts, and computer code. In our world, ambiguity is seen as a flaw. We want language to be a straight line. If a word has 3 meanings, we demand to know which one is correct and we throw the other 2 away.
Right, we want clarity.
But for the 7th century Arab, polysemy wasn't a flaw. It was a mark of ijaz.
Ijaz. The inimitable conciseness and eloquence of the text.
Yes. For them, the ability to use a single root word to activate a literal meaning, what they call hakika, and a figurative meaning mashaz, and a legal meaning, all at the exact same time, was the height of linguistic beauty. The text was multidimensional.
I am trying to visualize this. It's sort of like taking a complex 3-dimensional object. Imagine a beautifully carved wooden sphere, full of ridges and shadows and depth. But a modern translation just takes that sphere and smashes it flat onto a 2-dimensional piece of paper.
That is a brilliant analogy.
You can see the outline maybe, but you've destroyed all the depth, all the shadows, all the actual form.
We are mathematically reducing the dimensions of the language. When we force an Arabic word that meant 5 things into an English word that only means 1 thing, we are flattening the sphere.
But wait, let me ask you this. If a word means 5 different things, how did the people in the 7th century not just get confused all the time? I mean, if someone talks to me in riddles, I don't think it's beautiful, I just get frustrated.
They didn't get confused because of context. The scholars called these contextual indicators Quran.
Coralin.
Yes. The meaning was locked in by the flow of the sentence, the historical situation, who was speaking, who was being addressed, the tribal context, even the poetic meter.
So they had all the pieces of the puzzle around the word to tell them exactly how it was behaving in that moment.
They lived inside the puzzle. But when we come along 1,400 years later, we strip away all those contextual indicators. We read the word in isolation, on a flat page, in a completely different language.
And this isn't just an abstract academic problem. We aren't just talking about poetry here. This flattening of language has real-world consequences. We see actual crises today. People argue, they fight, they build whole ideologies. They even justify violence based on words that have been disastrously flattened by modern literalism.
And we see it from both extremes.
Right. You have secular critics attacking the text on one side and religious extremists weaponizing the text on the other. And the tragedy is they're both making the exact same linguistic mistake. Let's talk about some specific words. Let's look at a few case studies that cause immense pain and misunderstanding today.
We should. Let's explore them slowly.
We just talked about how misunderstanding language flattens reality. Let's start with a word that you see heavily debated today, fitna. In almost every modern English translation I pick up, it is translated as temptation or persecution. And there is a very famous verse in chapter 2 of the Quran that says, fitna is worse than killing.
Yes, verse 191.
Now, a modern literalist or a critic reads, fitna is worse than killing. They look at a translation, see fitna translated as disbelief or temptation, and they conclude that the text is saying if someone disagrees with your religion, their disbelief is worse than murder, so you are justified in fighting them.
Which is a catastrophic misreading. It distorts the theology completely.
Right.
To understand what is actually happening in that verse, we cannot rely on the English word temptation. We have to go back to the 7th century root of the word.
Okay.
The root is ftn. In classical Arabic, the primary physical meaning of fatana was the act of a blacksmith smelting metal.
Smelting metal, like putting raw ore into a fire.
Exactly. You put gold or silver into a blazing, intense furnace. You melt it down to burn away the impurities and find out what is truly pure. It was a physical, intense, and painful process.
Right.
So when the Arabs took that physical word and applied it to society, it didn't just mean a mild internal temptation, the way someone today might read St. Augustine's ideas of temptation. It meant a severe, fiery trial.
A test by fire.
Yes, it meant severe social fracture. It meant systemic coercion. It was the testing of loyalty under extreme, life-threatening duress.
But wait, if it means smelting metal and severe social fracture, how does a modern translator even make the leap to just temptation or disbelief? That feels like a deliberate mistranslation rather than just an accident.
Well, it comes from trying to find a single English equivalent for a complex historical reality. Let's look at the historical context of that specific verse. When it was revealed, the early Muslims in Mecca weren't just experiencing a polite difference of opinion with their neighbor.
Right, they were being tortured.
They were being dragged through the burning sands. People like Bilal were being crushed under heavy stones. They were facing systemic, forced apostasy. Their families were being violently torn apart. That systemic, violent persecution, that attempt to force someone to abandon their truth through physical torture, that was the fitna. It was the fire smelting the community.
So when the text says that kind of fitna is worse than killing the shat.
It is making a profound moral statement. It is saying that subjecting an entire community to systemic torture, stripping away their religious freedom, and forcing them to recant their faith under pain of death is a graver moral crime than the tragic casualties of the defensive warfare required to stop it.
SubhanAllah, when you explain it like that, it makes total sense. It is a defense of human rights. But if you strip away the history of the Meccan torture, if you strip away the linguistic root of smelting metal, and you just flatten the word into intellectual disbelief, you completely destroy the verse. You turn a verse about stopping violent persecution into a verse that sounds intolerant.
And that is exactly how linguistic anachronism creates chaos. You're taking a very specific historical fire and calling it a generic disagreement.
Let's look at another one, because this flattening does just as much damage on the micro level inside the home. This is probably one of the most debated, most painful verses for modern readers. Chapter 4, verse 34. The word is daraba.
Yes. This is often translated in modern English texts simply as beat them or strike them, referring to a sequence of actions a husband may take in a situation of severe marital fracture and rebellion.
When you read that translation today, it sounds terrible. It sounds like an institutionalized permit for domestic violence. And you see people weaponizing this every day. You have critics attacking the text as inherently abusive, and sadly, you have some men using that flattened translation to justify actually harming their spouses.
It is a tragedy. Both sides are ignoring the linguistic reality of 7th century Arabic. The root word drb is one of the most polysemous, fluid, context-dependent verbs in the entire classical language. The great classical lexicographer Al-Azmai noted that it has dozens of meanings.
Dozens, like what?
Well, it can mean to strike something physically, yes, but it also means to travel. The phrase darba fi al-ard means to journey through the earth. It means to coin a parable, to play a musical instrument, to pitch a tent, to draw a boundary line.
Hold on, if I tell someone I'm going to pitch a tent and they think I'm threatening to hit them, we have a serious communication breakdown. How do you know which one it is?
Context. Syntactic clues. And in classical usage, daraba frequently carried the idiomatic meaning of separation or turning away.
Yeah.
There's an old Arabic phrase, daraba al-daru bainana, which means time caused separation between us.
So how did the earliest authorities, the people who actually lived closer to that time, understand it in the context of this specific verse about a failing marriage?
There was significant scholarly debate, which itself proves the word wasn't a simple, blunt command to be violent. Many classical jurists looked at the Prophet Muhammad's own life. He explicitly condemned wife-beating and famously never raised his hand against a woman. So they placed severe restrictions on the word. They said if it involved any physical action at all, it could not leave a mark, it could not cause pain, and it was purely a symbolic gesture of severe displeasure.
You always hear the example of tapping with a miswak, a small toothbrush twig.
Right. But there was another very powerful interpretive tradition. Early authorities, like the great scholar Atta ibn Abi Rabah from Mecca, understood the word idiomatically based on its other meanings. They interpreted daraba here as mafaraka, to separate, or to turn away.
Which honestly fits perfectly with the flow of the verses, because it outlines a progression of a failing marriage. First you admonish, then you separate beds, and finally you separate yourself from the situation. You leave.
Exactly. The very next verse talks about bringing in arbitrators from both families. So the logical progression is towards distance and mediation, not battery. But modern literalism ignores all of this.
It ignores the 40 other meanings of the word.
It ignores the syntactic context, it ignores the classical juristic debates, it ignores the prophetic example, and it just stamps the English word beat onto the page.
It flattens the 3D object again, and the pain that causes in real life inside actual families is immense. Let's move to a word that has global political implications. A word you hear on the news almost every day: jihad.
And its related, more specific term, qital.
If you turn on the television anywhere in the West, jihad is translated instantly as holy war.
Which is fascinating linguistically.
Yeah.
Because holy war is not an Arabic concept. There is no such phrase in classical Islamic texts. Holy war is a calque, a direct translation of the Latin phrase bellum sacrum.
Wait, bellum sacrum, that's from the Christian Crusades, isn't it?
It is. It is a European medieval concept.
So we are literally projecting a European crusader concept onto a 7th century Arabic word.
Precisely. We are importing a foreign historical experience into the text. In classical Arabic, the root jhd means exertion, striving, toiling, enduring hardship. It's a comprehensive, holistic term for struggling against your own ego, striving against corruption in society, speaking truth to an unjust ruler, and yes, sometimes striving against an enemy on the battlefield.
But the word for actual physical combat is different, right?
Yes, the specific word for combat is qital. And in the 7th century tribal context, qital was not a free-for-all. It was not a chaotic holy war to kill non-believers. It was heavily regulated by strict codes of restraint.
Give me an idea of those rules.
The rules of qital stated you do not harm non-combatants, you do not kill women or children, you do not destroy crops or cut down trees, you do not harm monks in their monasteries, you do not fight simply to force people to convert.
So it was primarily defensive or governed by treaties?
Exactly. It was a regulated, solemn necessity. So when modern extremists or modern critics take the word jihad, strip away all the classical limits on warfare, ignore the tribal codes of proportionality, and translate it as an open-ended holy war, they are not reading the 7th century text, they are reading a modern, politicized caricature.
And people die because of that mistranslation. It fuels propaganda on all sides. An extremist uses the bad translation to recruit, and an Islamophobe uses the exact same bad translation to spread fear.
It is a vicious cycle.
Let's look at one more example. We talked about marital fracture earlier, but let's talk about the structure of the family itself. The word qawm. Also from chapter 4, verse 34. The verse says, men are quomon over women.
A word that modern translations often render as in charge of, dominant over, or the managers of.
Which immediately imports a very specific modern patriarchal authority dynamic. It makes it sound like an employer-employee relationship.
Right. But let's look at the root of the word. QWM. It denotes standing up, actively maintaining something, taking responsibility for something. In the 7th century, pre-industrial kinship system, Quwama was tied directly to economic provision. It meant the financial responsibility to protect and maintain the household.
So it was about duty, not an ontological statement that men are just smarter or inherently dominant.
Exactly. It was a functional, practical role based on the harsh economic realities of that time and place, where men were the primary earners and physical protectors in a desert environment. Women kept their own wealth, but men were legally obligated to spend theirs on the family.
That makes sense.
That is what Kawamon meant. To translate it today as a blank check for male dominance or toxic patriarchy is to ignore the lexical root and the historical economic context entirely.
It is really sobering to think about. I mean, you look at all these global conflicts, the sectarian debates, the pain within families, the misunderstanding between cultures, and so much of it stems entirely from reading modern dictionary definitions into ancient verses.
It is the tragedy of anachronism. We are reading ourselves into the text rather than reading the text on its own terms.
But this brings up a massive philosophical question, and I know anyone listening right now is thinking this. The Quran repeatedly describes itself as a clear book. Kitabun Mubin.
Yes, it does. It heavily emphasizes its own clarity.
So if it is supposed to be a clear book, why does a person seemingly need a degree in ancient philology and historical linguistics just to read it without making a catastrophic mistake? How can it be clear if the language is this much of a minefield?
That is the most important question we can ask, really. And the answer requires us to define what clear actually means. When the Quran calls itself mubin, it means it possessed absolute structural coherence, rhetorical precision, and clarity relative to its original 7th century audience.
Let me stop you there. Relative to the people it was first spoken to.
Yes. To the Bedouin in the Hijaz, the language was perfectly clear. They understood the idioms, the metaphors, the polythemy, the legal nuances, because they lived them. The text used their exact vocabulary.
Right.
If the revelation had used 21st century English idioms, it would have been completely meaningless to the people tasked with memorizing and preserving it.
That makes perfect sense. It spoke the language of its time. If I tell my grandfather a joke using internet slang from today, he won't think I'm clear. He'll think I'm speaking nonsense.
Precisely. Furthermore, we have to distinguish between the foundational moral message of the text and its precise legal or jurisprudential applications.
Walk me through that difference. What is the core moral message versus the legal?
The foundational moral message that God is one, that we should care for the orphan, that we must be just, that arrogance is destructive, that there is an afterlife. That message is immediately clear to anyone in any language, in any translation. You don't need a linguistic degree to understand basic human ethics.
Right. The core is accessible. If I read, "do not oppress the orphan" in English, the meaning gets across perfectly.
But when you get into the precise legal rulings, how to divide a complex inheritance, when exactly the use of force is permitted, the boundaries of marriage contracts, it requires the specific linguistic ecosystem. That requires precision. You cannot guess the law based on a loose translation.
And the early Muslims recognized that the language was fluid, didn't they? I mean, even the Quran itself wasn't frozen into just one single rigid way of speaking from day one.
No, it wasn't. We see this in the concepts of the aruf and the kirat. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught the Quran in 7 different aruf, or modes of revelation.
What were those modes exactly?
They were divine concessions to the dialectal diversity of the different Arabian tribes. The tribes spread across the peninsula didn't all pronounce things exactly the same way. Sometimes they used slightly different synonyms for a word. The revelation accommodated this. It showed that the text was meant to be flexible, an oral, living reality, rather than rigidly frozen in a single visual script.
So a different tribe could use a slightly different dialectal word, and it was still considered the valid divine text.
Yes. The canonical recitations, the Qur'at, preserved some of these slight variations. And rather than causing confusion, classical scholars noted that these variations actually added depth and nuance to the meanings.
But I have to push back here. I really want to challenge this idea. If we admit that a normal, everyday person today cannot fully grasp the legal and historical depths of the text without consulting ancient scholars, philologists, and all these traditional sciences, Doesn't that effectively create a clergy?
I see where you're going.
Doesn't it put a massive wall between the everyday believer and the holy text?
It is a very common concern, especially in the modern world where we value individualism and direct access to everything. We want to be able to Google a verse and instantly know the absolute truth.
Exactly.
But we have to ask ourselves, does relying on an expert mean we are submitting to a clergy in a religious sense? If you are sick and you go to a medical doctor because they have spent 12 years studying anatomy, biology, and pharmacology, are you treating that doctor as a priest?
No, of course not. I am just acknowledging they know how the human body works better than I do.
Exactly. The classical Islamic sciences, tafsir for exegesis, usul of fiqh for the principles of jurisprudence, were not built by a clergy trying to hide the text to keep power and wealth for themselves. They were built to transport the meaning of the text safely across the abyss of time. They are tools of preservation, not walls of obstruction.
So the tradition is a bridge.
It is the only bridge we have. If you bypass the scholarly tradition, you aren't recovering the original meaning. Let's look at a science like Asbab al-Nuzul, the occasions of revelation.
Okay, that is understanding why a specific verse came down at a specific time, right?
Yes, this science anchors verses to their exact historical moments. So when a verse contains a severe battlefield command, the science of Asbab al-Nuzul tells us exactly which battle, in which year, against which treaty-breaking enemy that verse was addressing.
So that a 7th century battlefield command isn't mistakenly treated as a universal, timeless rule for walking down a modern street today.
Precisely. Without that traditional science to anchor it, you are left with a floating, contextless quote that can be weaponized by absolutely anyone.
Let me ask you about the future, though. What about when modern situations arise that aren't in the text at all? If the text is locked in the 7th century and the scholars anchored everything to the past, how does the law stay relevant? How does it handle something that didn't exist back then?
Through the science of qiyas, or analogical reasoning, the scholars didn't just read the literal words like robots. They looked for the ilah.
The ilah, what does that mean?
The ilah is the underlying reason, the effective cause behind a rule.
Break that down for me. Give me an example of how they find the ilah.
Take the prohibition of intoxicants. In the Quran, the word used is khamr. In the 7th century, the dictionary definition of khamr specifically referred to wine made from fermented grapes or dates. The text explicitly bans it.
Okay, so a literalist 1,400 years later, someone who just opens a dictionary and ignores the tradition might say, well, the text only mentions grape wine, so synthetic fentanyl or cocaine or modern designer drugs must be totally fine because they aren't in the definition of khamr.
Exactly. A strict, flat literalism would lead to that absurd conclusion. But classical scholars used qiyas. They debated rigorously. They asked, why exactly was grape wine banned? Was it banned because it is a liquid? Was it banned because it is red? Was it banned because it comes from grapes?
No, obviously not.
Right. They identified the true ilah, the fact that it causes intoxication and the loss of the intellect. It alters the mind.
So they extract that underlying reason.
And they apply it universally to any new substance that causes the same effect. So modern narcotics are banned, not because the 7th century word khamr literally meant fentanyl, but because the scholarly tradition provided a bridge to apply the timeless moral principle to a changing world.
That makes perfect sense. They took the spirit of the law, the mechanism of it, and applied it forward. It really shows that translating the text without these sciences isn't giving you direct access at all.
No, it is simply anachronistic projection. You are reading your own modern anxieties, your own politics, and your own cultural biases onto a linguistic fossil.
It really all comes down to epistemic humility, doesn't it?
It does, very much so.
The realization that we do not know everything, that we cannot just parachute into the ancient world and demand it speaks our language. We have to approach the past on its own terms. We have to be willing to sit down, look at a text, and admit that we might not instantly understand what we are reading. We have to do the work. We have to respect the distance.
To demand that a 7th century text rearrange itself to perfectly match our 21st century expectations is a profound form of arrogance. Humility is the prerequisite for true understanding.
If you are listening to this, I want you to think about the language you speak every single day, the slang you use, the idioms you share with your close friends, the way you text your family. In just a few hundred years, the words you use to express your deepest truth will likely be entirely misunderstood by your descendants. If human language is that fragile, how beautiful and demanding is the task of preserving a message meant for all of time? May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.